Okay, so this is a paper with my colleague Rahul Talang and colleagues Mattea at Catholic University in the Netherlands and Tommaso Valetti at Imperial College in London. We're trying to do two things in this paper. It is at this point well known in the literature that piracy hurts sales. And if you want to argue with me about that, feel free to do it afterwards. You're still wrong. It's also, we have an increasing number of studies. Joel actually has a very nice paper with Rahul on this that suggests that these reduced revenues from piracy also translate into reduced incentives to create. So Joel and Rahul's paper is in Bollywood. It shows that when piracy became rampant in Bollywood, both the number of Bollywood movies and the quality of movies decreased. Another colleague of mine, Brett Danner, and I have a paper that seems to suggest that in movies, actually piracy hurts, if you will, the most vulnerable movies, the most potentially culturally important movies. That there's some movies that were profitable before piracy and are still profitable after piracy, Iron Man 12, for example. And then there are other movies that are just at that margin of profitability that when piracy is included, become unprofitable and therefore no longer get made. And frequently those are the creatively important movies in the industry. Okay? So I think those two things are established. What we want to do in this paper first is try to look at the question of, is there anything you can do about this? Or what incentives do we need to put in place to bring people back from piracy to legal purchasing? So we're going to contribute to a pretty, an established literature in that genre. The second thing we want to do here, and the thing that we're particularly excited about, is do this in the context of a countrywide randomized experiment. So most of the papers in this literature that look at the impact of anti-piracy legislation are doing it in the context of archival data where you've got to come in and come up with creative ways of simulating a counterfactual. What would have happened to sales if I hadn't put this anti-piracy measure in place? What we're going to try to do here is work in advance of the anti-piracy measure being put in place with the people doing it to randomly treat parts of the UK with the anti-piracy measure and leave other parts of the UK out as a control group. I think this is exciting because I think this is where a lot of business decisions are going, using control treatment groups to make the business decisions. And I think this is an example of a policy decision that is moving in that direction as well. Okay, does that make sense? At the risk of spoiling the punchline, what I'm going to show you in 18 and a half minutes is, 16 and a half minutes is that what it looks like is sending notices in the UK caused about a 5% drop in piracy in the regions of the UK that received the notices relative to the control group that didn't receive the notices. Okay. All right, so a bunch of studies in this. Let me focus on the first study for a second because it's most closely related to the present study. And that is a study my colleagues and I did on the Adopi law in France. This was a law where the French government put in place a process whereby rights holders could identify pirates and then send them a notice. And what we did is we looked at iTunes sales in France versus a control group set of countries that had similar sales patterns before this law went into effect in France, and then compared the sales in France to the sales in the control group. And what the answer says is that sales in France went up by somewhere between 20 to 25%. What was interesting to us is the sales went up before the notices were ever sent. So when we presented this to purebred economists, what the economists said is the rational actor will wait. The penalties didn't go into effect until you got your third notice. The rational actor will wait until they get the second notice before making changes in their behavior. What the data seem to say is that the change in behavior came before the notices actually went out. The change in behavior came when people became aware that the law was going to go into effect. So it was the awareness that caused this change. A couple other papers that are interesting. We did a paper on the shutdown of the site Mega Upload. Here, again, if we were going to do this as an experiment, what I would have liked the Department of Justice to do would have been to shut down Mega Upload in randomly selected parts of the world over time. Surprisingly, they didn't ask for my opinion about that. So what we did here is we compared countries that were heavy users of Mega Upload to countries that were lighter users of Mega Upload. And what you see when you make that comparison is that shutting down Mega Upload caused somewhere between 7.5 to, or somewhere around a 7.5% increase in legal music sales. And the last set of studies look at ISP level blocking of sites. And generally what these show is that shutting down or blocking access to one site doesn't have much impact on user behavior. Legal sales don't go up, and users in some data we have tend to go off to VPNs or other ways of getting piracy. But we have a paper that looks at the UK. So when the UK shut down access to the Pirate Bay, there wasn't much change in legal. When the UK came back later and shut down 18 sites at the same time and then 53 sites at the same time, that's when you actually see the shift in behavior towards legal access. So I think the argument here is if I make it sufficiently hard for Joel to pirate his content, he will eventually switch over to legal. Okay. What we'd like to do here again is try to bring this two ways. What's the effectiveness of notice sending? Not just the education, but the actual notices on user behavior, both in the context of piracy and in the context of legal consumption. And then can we do this in a real world randomized experiment? Let me apologize, first of all, by saying we just got the legal data. It took us much longer to get the legal data out of the studios and a major streaming network, and we just haven't had a chance to analyze it yet. But hopefully before next year's mirror, we'll have that result. So what I'm going to show you today is just piracy. You're also going to hear me make a plea later on for music data. We have so far been unsuccessful at getting Spotify streaming data in the UK. And if anybody has good connections at Spotify, please see me afterwards. I have a wallet full of money, and I'd love to talk to you. Okay, so this is the setting of the research. In 2014, rights holders and the largest ISPs in the UK announced a partnership whereby they were going to conduct a three-pronged effort to hopefully reduce piracy in the UK. The first phase, which went into effect, two-pronged effort. The first phase, which went into effect in November, was a public education campaign. And this was a countrywide education campaign where they tried to inform citizens about alternatives to piracy and legal platforms. The second phase, and the one we're going to focus on, is a phase that started in January 2017, where they sent out notices to individual households that were caught pirating. And these notices went, first there was an informational notice, your IP address has been found to be pirating, please either stop that or secure your network. Second notice is, by the way, we caught you again, here are some legal alternatives. And the third notice is, by the way, if you keep doing this, your ISP can throttle your bandwidth and rights holders can actually take you to court and fine you. There was no fourth notice, there was no, and we're coming to your house with clubs. This was sort of a 3 strikes and then, not much. So this was relatively weak notices. And we're sort of interested to see whether this pans out. Part of the reason that we need to do this in an experimental setting, by the way, is that the notices are confounded at a country level with a bunch of other site blocks. So while the notices are being sent out, in fact, while the education is going on, the UK is also blocking at the ISP level sites. So to get this right, we want to somehow tease out the impact of the notices from the background impact of these blockings. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to randomly assign 3-digit postcodes in the UK to either a control or treatment condition. The UK has a postcode district set up, and what we did is we took these postcodes and we assigned about 80% of them to the treatment condition, and about 20% of them to the control condition. The treatment condition got notices, the control condition didn't. What we end up with are somewhere a little less than 3,000 unique postcode districts, and the average population in each of these is around 20,000, 21,000 users. I was talking to Joel. This is sort of a fun chart for me. This is one of those things where, you know, we went and we said, well, we should ask. They're going to say no, of course, but we should at least ask. And surprisingly, they said, yeah, we think we can pull that off. So that's what we've got in terms of the setup. In terms of the data, we've got 3 levels of data. The first is we observe infringements at a postcode level. So this is observed instances of somebody downloading a copyrighted piece of content. The second thing we observe is what are called copyright infringement reports. This is that an individual rights holder claims that content and creates a report to the ISPs that says, please report to your user that this copyright infringement occurred. And then the last one is email notices. This is the emails that actually get sent based on a copyright infringement report to the individual user. Only about 50% of the copyright infringement notices turn into emails. It's not clear to us what causes that difference. Some of it is that not all ISPs participate, but that's not all of it. We're hoping that's random, and I think we can see in the data that that's reasonably random. But full disclosure, CIRs don't directly equal emails. And then the last thing, like I said, which we just got is sales data for I think we can say iTunes. So movie sales and movie rentals on iTunes, and then streaming data for a major streaming platform who's asked to remain anonymous. And like I said, we'd love to add music streaming to this as well. All right, so the first thing you can do is visualize the data. So let's start by visualizing the data. What you'll see is the notices start in month 13. The black line are whoops, this is actually yeah, I'm sorry. This is, so the y-axis is piracy. This is infringements per month, per postcode. And the red line is the treatment group, and the black line is the control group. And what this says is, you know, in the pre-period, they move along pretty similarly, which is sort of what you'd hope to find with a randomized assignment. And then once the notices start going out, we see a little bit of a change, and that change seems to get larger over time, where the treated groups tend to have lower piracy than the control group postcodes. So here we want to ask 2 questions, and that is, A, in a difference in difference framework, so comparing the treated to the control. Did we see a different level of piracy in the treated groups and in the control group? And then second is, do we see that vary over time? So we're going to look at the 5 months of data, or 5 quarters of data we have in our data. And at the risk of putting up an ugly regression chart, what this basically says is, you can read this as the drop in piracy infringements in each quarter after the notices go out. So what this says is that in each quarter, treated postcodes had negative, had a drop in each quarter. That becomes statistically significant in quarters 3, 4, and 5. And basically what this says is that in Q3, there were about 161 fewer infringements in the treated postcodes than there were in the control postcodes, 205 and then 176. Putting this in context, you can compare that drop to the actual infringements observed in the control postcodes, and what this translates to is about a 5% drop in total infringements. Okay. Another way to put this in context is to compare it to the amount of emails that were actually sent. So you can go in here and you can say, okay, what is that what is a 161 or 205 drop on a per postcode basis translate into in terms of total lost infringements? And that means that there were about 2.2 million fewer infringements in the third and fourth quarter than there otherwise would have been in the treated postcodes. There were about 383,000 emails sent to those in those postcodes. And what that means is that one email translates into about 6 fewer infringements, which is large, but I think not implausibly large. Larger than I expected, but not implausibly large. But these things actually tend to have an effect. So again, I think this is an example of of an actual randomized policy experiment. And what's been fun working with the studios is they actually care about the answer. Their attitude here is it's expensive for us to do this, both in terms of dollars and in terms of potential lost customer goodwill. If it doesn't work, let's stop doing it. And if it does work, let's do it more. So it seems like it does work at least at changing user behavior. This is over and above any educational awareness, over and above any educational. And again, in France, we saw that the big jump came from education. So this is an underestimate on what we think is the true effect of this program. And it confirms the prior literature that even sort of mild interventions can change user behavior. What do we want to do next? Figure out where these missing infringements go. Right? I can imagine a world where these folks use VPNs or some other technological method that makes it harder to observe them. I can also imagine a world where these folks go to legal services, and we're excited about seeing which of those two worlds we live in. This is the third and last time I'll make another plea for music streaming. Would love to get that into this. And then we've got a couple ideas of different ways we can analyze this. Right now we're analyzing this at the infringement level. We've asked for data at the user level, so the emails are actually sent to individuals. Joel gets an email. Maybe we should be looking at how that changes Joel's behavior as opposed to how that changes total infringements. And we're also curious about whether this has heterogeneous effects across different postcodes, either by demographics or by size. Does this affect people in the country differently than it affects people in the city? Okay. And with that, I think I have a few minutes for questions. Is that okay?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, first, give some applause.
Sure.
Are you planning to look at this longitudinally? Because I can imagine, say, a year or two later, after you've gotten your notices and nothing happens, the numbers would avert.
Yeah, we'd love to do that, and I think the fact that we've got a controlled treatment would allow us to do that fairly readily. So yeah, that's the goal. And the data keep rolling in. Like I said, we haven't gotten the fifth quarter emails yet, and so yeah, we'd love to do that. Great point. Sure.
Your last point about heterogeneous effects, I was wondering when you showed that first map, if you don't have to show it, but like if you could show how the piracy rate varied by postcode to start with, because presumably you're not starting from the same base in different postcodes.
Yeah, it's so, and honestly, that's another thing we'd like to do is run this regression in sort of a two-stage format, right? The first stage being how much piracy was reduced in this particular postcode, and then the second stage being what did that do to sales? And the idea would be postcodes that had a larger reduction in piracy should also have a higher increase in sales. So we could show the variation in piracy across the country. I don't think that's going to hurt our identification strategy because we randomly assign. If this were purely observational, yeah, we'd have to worry about that. I think the fact that we randomly assigned is okay, and I didn't include the slide, but the treated and the control look pretty similar on just about everything, including pre-piracy. Sure. And I'm going to ignore this section of the audience because I can't see your hands. So if okay, that's the perfect solution to that problem. You're next, but you're first.
So one thing you could do is also think a little bit about the network. So if I and all my friends get this piracy notice, then I might respond more than if I get it and nobody else does.
Yeah. No, that's.
So it seems like you have to be able to work with that as well. Potentially. I don't know.
Yeah, that's something to think about. I'd love to be able to say, yeah, again, Alan gets a piracy notice and he tells all of his friends to stop pirating. I guess we're measuring that now if all of Alan's friends live close to him. But that would spill out over into the control group if Alan is talking to friends who live in the control group postcodes, and it would bias our result down. And I think he's right.
You can basically tease it out by looking at those postal codes that get the notices that are right next to ones that
Yeah.
don't get the notices and see what the load goes on.
That's good. That's good. Okay, the mystery person in this area.
Is the piracy case here always a download, or were you able to determine how many pirate screens?
This is all peer-to-peer, and that's the only way. That's the only way you can see it. So it is entirely possible these people move from peer-to-peer piracy to streaming piracy. And like I say, it's entirely possible that they start using VPNs. And that's sort of what we saw in the UK, where the initial shutting down the Pirate Bay caused people to start using VPNs and people to start using streaming. And then shutting down the 18 and 53 sites is where you actually saw the change. Whether this was a big enough intervention to change people's behavior, I don't know.
And there's another one back there.
Sure.
Well, what we learned from Napster is you don't want to sue your own consumer. So the thing that I'm concerned about is you don't want to stop consumption. So how do you know that the copyright infringement notices aren't just stopping them altogether?
It's a great question. That's why it's so important to figure out, is this having any impact on legal consumption, right? If I'm sending these notices out and I'm pissing off my consumers and it's not having any impact on revenue, let's stop doing that. Versus a world, if I'm sending these out and either people didn't know this was illegal or they suddenly, had an epiphany that I should stop doing this and they go to legal channels, that would be very good. And other research we've done shows that people are actually pretty sticky to their mode of consumption. That once you start pirating, it's hard to get you to stop, and once you start consuming legal, you don't tend to go back. So I think a lot of this paper, a lot of the policy implications of this paper hinge on the legal aspect. Sure.
It's a great study, and you've done other great studies on site blocking and so on. Let's say someone from the US, let's say someone from a competent US administration comes to you and says, Mike, we want to introduce some sort of anti-piracy action here in the US. We want it to stop piracy. We want it to generate sales. Do we site block? Do we send letters? Do we do some sort of combination? Do we do one and then the other? What do you say to me?
It's a great question. I think it'll depend on what the legal says. If you ask me that right now, based on the literature, I think site blocking. If you look across the studies in the literature, I think site blocking has been the most effective in increasing legal consumption. Basically, just making it harder for you to get access to the sites out there. We've got, Right now, we're not seeing much in the legal data. There might be a small increase, but it's not 5%. And Rahul told me not to talk about that because it's so early, so don't tell him I talked about that. But you know, I don't think we're going to see the same increase in legal that we saw in the UK site blocking that in this effort. Does that make sense? Other questions? All right, friends, thank you.